I stood frozen as the sheriff nailed an eviction notice to my door, the HOA president smirking beside him. They'd seized my land through bribery and corruption, not realizing my father's badge carried more weight than theirs. What would their faces look like when they discovered the chief of police was about to crash their carefully orchestrated land grab? "Get those disgusting vegetables off my sight line," Diane screamed over the fence, her manicured fingernails gripping the wooden slats until her knuckles went white. I looked up from my kneeling position, dirt still fresh under my nails, confused by her sudden outburst. "These tomato plants are on my property, Diane," I explained calmly, wiping sweat from my forehead. "They're not hurting anyone. They're an eyesore. Roger and I paid too much for this house to look at your farmer's market experiment." I stood slowly, brushing soil from my jeans. This wasn't our first argument about my garden, but Diane seemed extra angry today. Her perfectly styled blonde hair barely moved as she shook with rage. "The HOA rules say I can grow vegetables in my backyard," I replied, keeping my voice steady despite my rising frustration. "Rules can change," she hissed before storming back into her enormous house. I returned to my plants, trying to shake off her threat. My garden was my peace after long days at work. When my mother passed away last year, tending these vegetables became my therapy. Each plant grew from seeds she had saved. I wasn't giving them up because Diane wanted a more Instagram-worthy view. The next morning, I discovered a bright yellow notice stabbed into my lawn. "Property violation. Unauthorized garden extension." I yanked it out, reading the ridiculous claims that my garden extended 3 feet into community property. From across the street, I noticed Tyler watching me, concern etched on his face. He jogged over, glancing nervously at Diane's house. "They did it," he whispered. "Roger called an emergency HOA meeting last night. Only his friends were invited. They can't just decide my property line moved overnight," I said, my hands trembling with anger. "There's more," Tyler continued, lowering his voice further. "I overheard Roger on the phone with Sheriff Wilson yesterday. Something about making the problem property available and generous campaign contributions." My stomach dropped. Roger, as HOA president, had connections throughout Pinecrest Heights. Sheriff Wilson's re-election campaign signs were everywhere, including a particularly large one in Roger and Diane's yard. "Thanks for the warning," I said, folding the notice into my pocket. Inside, I pulled out my property documents. The deed clearly showed the garden was within my boundaries. I took photos of the garden and the property markers, then emailed them to the HOA's official address with a firmly worded response. The reply came within minutes. "The board has reviewed updated land surveys. Your documentation is outdated. Correct the violation within 48 hours or face penalties." I called my lawyer immediately. While waiting for him to call back, I noticed an enormous truck pulling up outside. Men in uniforms poured out, heading straight for my garden. I raced outside. "Stop! What are you doing?" Roger appeared from behind the truck, a clipboard in hand. "Enforcement of HOA violations, as permitted in the covenant you signed. You can't just take my land," I protested, stepping between the workers and my garden. "Actually, we can." Roger's thin smile made my skin crawl. "It's not your land anymore. The updated survey shows it belongs to the community." "What updated survey? I was never notified of any new survey. It was in the newsletter." He smirked. "Not my fault if you don't read community updates." My phone buzzed my lawyer. "Don't let them touch anything. I'm on my way." "My lawyer says you need to leave," I told Roger, trying to project confidence. He laughed. "Your lawyer can talk to Sheriff Wilson. He's fully aware of our actions today." As if summoned, a patrol car pulled up. Sheriff Wilson stepped out, thumbs hooked in his belt loops. He nodded to Roger before approaching me. "We've had complaints about a disturbance," he drawled, though no one had called. "They're trying to steal part of my property," I explained, showing him my deed. "This is illegal." The sheriff barely glanced at the documents. "Looks like an HOA matter to me. They have authority to enforce their rules." Behind him, Workers began ripping out my tomato plants, tossing my mother's legacy into trash bags. Diane watched from her window, phone in hand, likely recording my humiliation for the neighborhood gossip group. "Those plants are special," I pleaded. "At least let me transplant them." "Should have thought about that before breaking the rules," Roger replied, checking items off his clipboard. Something inside me snapped. I hadn't called my father for help since moving here. He'd raised me to handle my own problems. But as Sheriff Wilson stood there, clearly in Roger's pocket, I realized this fight might require family reinforcement. I retreated inside while the workers continued destroying my garden. With shaking hands, I dialed. "Dad? It's me. I need your help. Remember how you always said to know when a fight is bigger than yourself? I think I'm there." "What's happened?" His voice carried the authority of 15 years as chief of police in the neighboring county. "The HOA is seizing part of my property. They've bribed the local sheriff. They're destroying Mom's garden right now." His silence spoke volumes. Finally, he said, "Take photos of everything. Record any conversations. Don't sign anything. I'll be there tomorrow." When I hung up, I noticed an email notification. Subject line, Community Improvement Project Announcement. The message detailed plans for a neighborhood enhancement on several properties, including the slice of land they were currently stealing from me. Attached was a rendering of luxury condominiums replacing our homes. I stared at the screen in shock. This wasn't about my garden at all. They wanted my entire property. Through the window, I watched Sheriff Wilson shake hands with Roger before driving away. The workers had finished destroying my garden and were now hammering stakes along a new property line, slicing away nearly a quarter of my yard. Tyler appeared beside them, pretending to admire their work while secretly taking pictures. Our eyes met briefly through the window. He gave an almost imperceptible nod before walking away. I looked down at my phone, my father's contact information still on screen. What Roger, Diane, and Sheriff Wilson didn't know was that they'd picked the wrong house to target. Tomorrow, they'd learn exactly who my father was, and this seemingly simple garden dispute would explode into something none of them were prepared for. But tonight I had research to do. If they wanted war, I needed ammunition. "Is your dad really the chief of police?" Tyler whispered as we huddled in my kitchen the next morning. Through the window, Roger was directing a surveyor who was placing even more stakes in my yard. 20 years in law enforcement, 15 as chief in Riverdale County. I confirmed, sliding over my laptop. "Look what I found last night." Tyler's eyes widened as he scrolled through the documents I'd discovered. Property assessments, zoning change requests. Wait, is that Roger's signature on a development contract? I nodded grimly. The HOA isn't just taking my garden. They're trying to force out half the neighborhood for some big development deal. The doorbell rang, making us both jump. Through the peephole, I spotted a delivery person holding a large envelope. The return address showed my lawyer's office. "Legal papers already?" Tyler asked as I signed for the package. I tore it open, scanning the contents. Worse, it's a cease and desist order, claiming I'm interfering with HOA business by documenting their actions. They're threatening to put a lien on my house. "They can't do that," Tyler protested. "They shouldn't be able to." I agreed. But look who signed off on it. Tyler peered at the signature. "Sheriff Wilson? He can't enforce HOA rules like this." "He can if they've convinced a judge their new property lines are legitimate." I slumped into a chair. "My lawyer says we need to counterfile immediately, but that could take weeks." A large SUV pulled into my driveway. My heart leaped as my father stepped out, still wearing his chief's uniform. He surveyed the scene with the calculated gaze that had intimidated criminals for decades. "Don't tell anyone who he is yet," I whispered to Tyler. "We need to understand exactly what we're dealing with first." Dad entered without knocking, instantly filling the small kitchen with his commanding presence. He hugged me briefly before turning his attention to the papers spread across my table. "Tyler's been helping me," I explained. "He lives across the street." Dad nodded respectfully to Tyler before focusing on me. Show me everything, start to finish. For the next hour, we laid out the whole story. The garden dispute, the sudden survey changes, the sheriff's involvement, and finally, the development plans I'd uncovered. Classic land grab, Dad concluded, his expression darkening. They're using the HOA as cover for a real estate scheme. But why target me first? I asked. Corner properties are valuable for development, Dad explained. Your lot gives them street access on two sides. Plus, you live alone, no family in town. Except they didn't know about me. Commotion outside drew our attention. Through the window, we saw Roger arguing with the surveyor, pointing repeatedly at a map, then at my house. Something's wrong with their plan, Tyler observed. Dad's phone buzzed. He checked it, a slight smile forming. My department just ran background checks on Roger, Diane, and your Sheriff Wilson. Interesting connections are popping up. Like what? I asked. Roger worked for Maplewood Developers 6 years ago, the same company that submitted those condo plans. And Wilson's campaign treasurer is Roger's brother-in-law. A knock at the door interrupted us. I peeked out to see Roger himself, flanked by 2 men in suits. Don't tell them who I am, Dad whispered, removing his badge and tucking it into his pocket. Let's see what they want first. I opened the door cautiously, standing firm in the entrance. Can I help you? Roger's false smile didn't reach his eyes. We need to discuss an urgent matter regarding your property. My lawyer says I shouldn't talk to you without him present. This isn't optional, Roger replied, his smile vanishing. These gentlemen represent Maplewood Developers. They need access to inspect your foundation. One suit stepped forward. We have concerns about structural integrity that could affect neighboring properties. You need a court order for that, I stated firmly. Actually, the second suit interjected. The HOA covenant gives us right of entry for safety inspections. Section 8, paragraph 4. Dad appeared behind me. That section refers to common areas, not private residences. I've read your covenant very carefully. Roger's eyes narrowed. And you are? A family friend helping with some home repairs, Dad replied calmly. Roger studied him suspiciously before continuing. Whatever. The fact remains we need access today. No, I said simply. Then we'll get Sheriff Wilson to escort us in, Roger threatened. On what grounds? Dad asked. Obstruction of a safety inspection, Roger snapped. Interesting, Dad mused. Is the sheriff in the habit of enforcing civil HOA matters rather than actual laws? Roger's face reddened. Who exactly are you? Before Dad could answer, a news van pulled up across the street. A reporter and cameraman got out, surveying the neighborhood. What's this now? Roger muttered, clearly thrown off balance. Tyler appeared beside the news crew, pointing toward my house. The reporter nodded eagerly, heading our way. Roger panicked. We'll continue this discussion later, he said, quickly retreating with his associates. You called the news? I asked Dad incredulously. No, Dad said. But I think your friend Tyler has good instincts. The reporter approached, microphone ready. I'm Sarah Chun from Channel 7 News. We received a tip about homeowners being forced out for a development project. Would you be willing to comment? I glanced at Dad, who gave a subtle nod. Actually, I replied, I'd be happy to show you exactly what's happening here. For the next 20 minutes, I walked Sarah through everything. The garden dispute, the mysterious new survey, the development plans I discovered. The camera captured the stakes in my yard, the destroyed garden, and the cease and desist order. And who authorized these property line changes? Sarah asked. Sheriff Wilson signed off on them, I explained. Coincidentally, his re-election campaign received significant donations from the HOA's special fund last month. Sarah's eyebrows shot up. Do you have documentation of that? I nodded. And much more. As the interview wrapped up, Diane emerged from her house, marching toward us in a rage. What do you think you're doing? She shrieked. You can't talk to the media. That violates HOA rules. Freedom of speech isn't subject to HOA approval, Dad commented mildly. Sarah turned her microphone toward Diane. Would you like to comment on the allegations that the HOA is seizing private property for a development deal? Diane's face went pale. That's completely false. We're simply enforcing community standards. Then you wouldn't mind explaining these documents? I asked, holding up copies of the development plans with Roger's signature. Diane's expression transformed from shock to fury. You'll regret this, she hissed before storming back to her house. As the news van drove away, Dad's phone rang. His expression grew serious as he listened. That was my contact at the county records office, he said after hanging up. The property line changes were pushed through without proper review. And guess who notarized the documents? Sheriff Wilson's wife. Isn't that illegal? I asked. Highly, Dad confirmed. But here's something else interesting. The development plans require at least 5 properties to make the project viable. Yours is just the first. Tyler's phone chimed with a notification. He looked down and gasped. Roger just called an emergency HOA meeting for tonight. Members only. Dad smiled for the first time since arriving. Perfect timing. I think it's time Sheriff Wilson learned who he's really dealing with. As we formulated our plan for the meeting, my doorbell rang again. This time, it was a courier with an envelope marked urgent. Inside was a foreclosure notice. According to the document, I had failed to pay HOA dues for 6 months, resulting in a lien that was now being executed. But I've paid every month, I protested, showing Dad my bank statements. They're falsifying records, Dad concluded grimly. This is getting serious. Tyler peered out the window. Guys, Sheriff Wilson just pulled up at Roger and Diane's house, and he's got eviction papers in his hand. I felt the blood drain from my face. They're moving faster than we expected. Dad put his hand on my shoulder. Don't worry, this is where their plan falls apart. Because now, it's not just property theft. It's official misconduct and fraud. He pulled out his phone and badge. Who are you calling? I asked. The State Attorney General's office, Dad replied, his voice deadly quiet. And after that, my SWAT team commander. No one comes to evict my child from their rightful home, especially not a corrupt sheriff working for crooked developers. Tyler stared at Dad's badge in awe. They have no idea what's coming, do they? Dad's expression was stone cold as Sheriff Wilson approached my door with Roger and Diane trailing behind. Not a clue, he answered. But they're about to learn a hard lesson about picking the wrong family to bully. They've changed your property lines on paper, my lawyer said, sliding documents across her desk. She tapped at strange markings on the survey map. See these timestamps? These changes were made just 3 weeks ago. My stomach nodded. That's impossible. My family has owned this exact plot for 20 years. She nodded, her expression grim. Someone's manipulating county records. And there's more. Sheriff Wilson received a $15,000 donation to his re-election campaign from the HOA's special fund right before he signed off on these new surveys. I leaned forward, studying the papers. This isn't about my tomato plants at all, is it? No, she said, pulling up a building permit application on her computer. Maplewood developers filed this last month. They're planning luxury townhomes on several properties in Pinecrest Heights, including the piece of your land now in dispute. The pieces clicked together in my head. So the HOA isn't just taking my garden. They're trying to force me out completely. Roger stands to make a fortune if this development goes through, she confirmed. And he's not acting alone. Outside her office, rain pounded the windows as thunder cracked. The weather matched my mood perfectly. I called Dad from my car. I've been talking to people, Dad said after I explained everything. My old partner works in the county ethics department now. There's a pattern here. 3 other homeowners in your neighborhood have lost property to the HOA under fishy circumstances in the past year. All for this development deal? I asked, watching raindrops race down my windshield. Looks that way. The previous owners were elderly or single parents, people who couldn't fight back easily. But why target me? I'm not an easy mark. Dad's voice hardened. Maybe Roger doesn't know who your father is. Or maybe he's getting desperate to complete this deal. I stared at the HOA headquarters across the street, lights still on despite the late hour. There's a meeting tonight. Emergency session. Tyler texted me about it. Be careful, Dad warned. These people are crossing legal lines. That makes them dangerous. Tyler met me behind the community center, rainwater dripping from his baseball cap. They're all inside: Roger, Diane, Sheriff Wilson, and someone in an expensive suit, probably from Maplewood. He led me through a service entrance, past stacked chairs and folding tables. We crept down a hallway where voices echoed from the main meeting room. We can listen from here, Tyler whispered, pointing to a supply closet that shared a wall with the meeting room. Inside the cramped space, I pressed my ear against the thin wall. Roger's voice came through clearly. The Johnson property is the final piece, he was saying. Once we secure it, Maplewood can begin construction immediately. My client is concerned about the delays, a smooth voice replied. This was supposed to be wrapped up months ago. We've had complications, Roger admitted. But Sheriff Wilson has been extremely helpful. A chair scraped across the floor. Happy to assist, Wilson said, his voice smug. Consider it appreciation for your generous campaign contribution. Diane's high-pitched laugh made my skin crawl. And once the deal closes, our kickback increases by another $50,000. We'll be vacationing in Europe while these fools are fighting over parking spaces. I pulled out my phone and hit record, capturing every damning word. What about the Johnson property owner? The Maplewood representative asked. Any chance they'll cause problems? Nothing we can't handle, Roger assured him. If necessary, Sheriff Wilson can find reason to arrest them for obstruction. A night in jail tends to make people more cooperative. My hands shook with anger as I recorded their laughter. 20 years of memories in my home, and they were plotting to steal it with a few signatures and bribes. We move forward tomorrow, Roger announced. 9 a.m., Wilson serves the eviction notice. By noon, the bulldozers start clearing that eyesore of a garden. I backed away, determined to get this evidence to my lawyer immediately. In my haste, my elbow knocked against a stack of cleaning supplies. Bottles crashed to the floor with a deafening clatter. The meeting room went silent. Someone's there, Roger shouted. Tyler grabbed my arm. Run. Back door. We sprinted down the hallway as footsteps pounded behind us. I clutched my phone with its precious recording, heart hammering against my ribs. Stop right there. Sheriff Wilson's voice echoed down the corridor. We burst through the exit into the rain-soaked parking lot. Tyler pointed to a row of bushes. Split up. Meet at your place later. I dove into the darkness between buildings as flashlight beams swept across the parking lot. Wilson's angry voice carried through the rain. Find them. Nobody makes a fool of me in my own county. Crouching behind garbage bins, soaking wet and breathing hard, I checked my phone to make sure the recording had saved. The evidence was clear: conspiracy, bribery, abuse of power. What I didn't know then was that Roger had spotted me, and he was already plotting his revenge. Bright blue and red lights flashed through my windows at 6 a.m. 3 police cruisers blocked my driveway, neighbors peering from behind curtains at the commotion. Sheriff Wilson marched up my walkway, flanked by deputies and, most surprisingly, a news crew from Channel 8. Good morning, Wilson called loudly, clearly performing for the cameras. Got some papers for you to sign. I opened the door in my bathrobe, purposely looking confused and vulnerable for the cameras. What's this about, Sheriff? He thrust official-looking documents at my chest. Eviction notice. This property is now under HOA control due to unpaid association fees and multiple violations of community standards. The reporter shoved a microphone toward me. How do you respond to allegations that you've refused to pay HOA dues for 6 months? My mind raced. This was their move, making me look like the villain in a public spectacle. Roger stood across the street beside Diane, both wearing satisfied smiles as they watched my apparent downfall. I've never missed a payment, I said calmly, opening the folder where I kept all receipts. I have proof of every payment right here. Wilson waved dismissively. The HOA records show otherwise. You have 48 hours to vacate the premises. The reporter turned to Wilson. Sheriff, this seems like an unusual case for personal involvement. Why are you handling a civil matter yourself? Wilson puffed up his chest. Just doing my duty. Law and order applies to everyone in this county. Interesting, I said, smiling for the first time that morning. Actually, I'd like you all to meet someone. I stepped aside as my front door opened wider. Dad walked out, his chief of police uniform crisp and authoritative despite the early hour. The reporter's eyes widened, recognizing him immediately from his frequent television appearances. Wilson, Dad said coolly, you're a long way from your jurisdiction. The color drained from Wilson's face. Chief Johnson, I didn't realize. Clearly, Dad replied. He turned to the news crew. I'm Chief Johnson from Riverside County. This homeowner happens to be my child. Imagine my surprise when I learned a sheriff from a neighboring county was serving questionable eviction notices here. The camera swung to capture Wilson's expression of pure panic. Then back to Dad. For the record, Dad continued, my department has been working with state investigators on corruption cases involving improper relationships between development companies and local officials. How interesting to find you here, outside your jurisdiction, serving papers based on falsified records. The reporter's interest visibly shifted, sensing a bigger story. Chief Johnson, are you suggesting Sheriff Wilson is involved in? I'm not suggesting anything, Dad interrupted smoothly. Just finding the timing and circumstances curious. Perhaps Sheriff Wilson would like to explain his relationship with Maplewood developers? Or why his campaign received a $15,000 donation from the Pinecrest Heights HOA Special Fund last month. Wilson backed toward his cruiser. This is outrageous. I'm simply enforcing the rules. Roger rushed forward, trying to salvage the situation. This changes nothing. The HOA bylaws are clear, and we have documented violations. I pulled out my phone, keeping my voice steady. Would those be the same documents discussed at your secret meeting last night? The one where you talked about kickbacks from Maplewood developers and having Sheriff Wilson arrest me if I didn't cooperate. Roger's face contorted. You're making wild accusations. I have it all recorded, I said, holding up my phone. The neighbors who had gathered to watch fell silent. Every word about the bribes, the falsified property lines, and the plans to build luxury homes on stolen land. Tyler appeared from the crowd, carrying a thick folder. And I have signatures from 23 homeowners who've experienced similar intimidation tactics from this HOA board. We have enough signatures to force an emergency recall vote. The reporter turned to her cameraman. Are you getting this? Diane hurried across the street, her designer heels clicking on pavement. This is absurd. You can't believe these troublemakers. Then you won't mind if we examine the HOA's financial records, Dad said pleasantly. I'm sure you keep meticulous books. You need a warrant for that? Wilson snapped, finding his voice again. Dad smiled. Actually, we already have one. He pulled an official document from his pocket. State Financial Crimes Unit issued it yesterday. They'll be arriving shortly to secure the HOA offices and computers. The crowd of neighbors murmured as a black SUV with state investigator markings pulled up behind the police cruisers. Two serious-looking people in suits stepped out, surveying the scene. Roger's confident facade crumbled. He grabbed Diane's arm, whispering urgently in her ear. She yanked away from him, her voice shrill. This is your fault. I told you targeting the Johnson property was too risky. Maybe we should continue this conversation at the station, Dad suggested, nodding to the state investigators. I believe you all have a lot to explain. As Wilson, Roger, and Diane were escorted to separate vehicles, the reporter approached me again. Can we get your side of the story? How long has this been going on? For the first time in weeks, I felt the weight lifting from my shoulders. The neighbors gathered around, some offering apologies for not believing me sooner, others sharing their own stories of HOA intimidation. But as Roger was guided into the back of a police car, he locked eyes with me one last time. His expression sent ice through my veins. This wasn't over yet. He mouthed words I couldn't hear, but the message was clear. He still had cards to play. I turned back to the reporter, determined to expose every aspect of the corruption that had nearly cost me my home. It started with a garden, I began, but it ends with justice. What I didn't know then was that Roger had already set his backup plan in motion, one that would put me in even greater danger than before. Cameras flashed as I walked into the community center. News vans lined the street outside. My call to the local station had worked. Roger's face turned white when he spotted me. He'd expected me to be packing my things, not showing up with a folder full of evidence and the press in tow. "This meeting is for HOA members only," he sputtered, pointing at the news crew setting up in the back. "Perfect," I replied, my voice steady despite my racing heart. "Because I'm still a member, and I have some business to discuss." Diane rushed over, her designer heels clicking against the floor. "You can't just barge in here with cameras. This is private property." "Actually," I said, raising my voice so everyone could hear, "this center was built with our dues. It belongs to all of us." I nodded to the camera operator. "And today, everyone needs to see what's been happening." The crowd of neighbors grew silent. Some looked confused, others angry. Many had suffered from Roger and Diane's schemes but had been too afraid to speak up. "Before anyone calls the sheriff," I announced, "you should know he's currently answering questions at the county ethics department." I clicked a button on my laptop, and the projector lit up with bank statements. These show money moving from Maplewood developers to our HOA fund, then directly to Roger and Diane's personal accounts. Gasps rippled through the room. A woman in the back stood up. "Is that why they claimed my backyard fence was on community property last month? And why they tried to fine me $2,000 for my garden gnomes?" called another voice. Roger lunged for my laptop. "This is slander. You've doctored these documents." Dad stepped forward, blocking his path. "As chief of police from the neighboring district, I can verify these records were obtained legally and are authentic." His calm authority silenced the room. "The state attorney's office has been investigating similar schemes across 3 counties. Diane's perfectly maintained composure cracked. "Roger handled all the money. I didn't know anything about kickbacks." Roger's face twisted with rage. "Shut up, Diane." He turned to the crowd, desperation in his eyes. "These are necessary development funds for community improvements. Like the improvement of your vacation home in Florida?" I asked, clicking to the next slide showing property records. "Purchased the same week you received $175,000 from Maplewood?" An investigator from the state attorney's office stood up from where she'd been sitting quietly in the corner. "We've been building this case for months. Thanks for gathering everyone involved in one place." 2 officers appeared at the doorway. The crowd parted as they approached. "Roger and Diane Williams," the investigator announced. "You're wanted for questioning regarding financial fraud, bribery of public officials, and abuse of power." People began shouting questions all at once. Neighbors I'd barely spoken to crowded around my laptop, looking for evidence about their own property disputes. Tyler handed me a thick stack of papers. "Emergency petition to dissolve the current HOA board," he explained. "I've been collecting signatures for weeks. We have enough." As Roger was escorted toward the door, he twisted toward me, his voice a menacing whisper that only I could hear. "You have no idea who you're dealing with. Maplewood's owner plays bigger games than this. Your little victory won't last till morning." A chill ran down my spine as I watched him go. What did he mean? What was I still missing? My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Parking garage, level 3. Now, information about Maplewood you need to see." I looked at Dad, who was helping organize the chaos of the meeting. Should I tell him about the text? Or see what this mysterious informant had to share? Rain pounded against my windshield as I raced to the parking garage. My hand trembled slightly as I reached for my phone to text Dad my location, just in case. The garage seemed eerily empty, my footsteps echoing between concrete walls as I climbed to level 3. A figure stood in the shadows near a support column. As I approached, they stepped forward Ms. Jenkins, Roger's assistant from the HOA office. Her eyes darted nervously around the garage. "I've been keeping records," she whispered, handing me a USB drive. "Maplewood isn't just a development company. They're buying HOA board members across the state, getting property for pennies on the dollar." Her voice shook. "The owner is State Senator Whitman." My stomach dropped. No wonder Roger had been so confident. "There's more," she continued. "They're planning to build." Tires screeched at the garage entrance. Headlights swept across the walls. "They followed me," Miss Jenkins gasped. "You need to go. Now." I sprinted for the stairs, clutching the USB drive. Behind me, car doors slammed and voices shouted. I texted Dad. SOS, garage. Senator Whitman involved. 20 minutes later, squad cars surrounded my house. Dad paced the living room while I connected the USB to my laptop. "This is bigger than we thought," Dad said grimly. "Whitman sits on the county zoning board." The files revealed everything: falsified surveys, bribes to officials in 3 counties, forged property documents. Most shocking was a map showing Pinecrest Heights completely razed, replaced with a private resort and golf course. "They weren't just after your garden," Tyler said, looking over my shoulder. "They wanted our entire neighborhood." Dad made a call. "My friend at the FBI needs to see this. This crosses county lines." 3 days later, news broke across the state. FBI agents raided Senator Whitman's office and Maplewood headquarters simultaneously. Sheriff Wilson agreed to testify in exchange for leniency. Roger and Diane faced multiple felony charges. But revenge wasn't sweet, it was exhausting. Court appearances consumed my days. Anonymous threats appeared in my mailbox. Someone slashed my tires. Twice. "You could stay at my place until this blows over," Dad suggested after a particularly tense hearing where Senator Whitman's lawyer tried to paint me as a troublemaker with a vendetta. "No," I replied firmly. "This is my home. I won't be scared away." That night, neighbors I barely knew formed a protection detail, taking shifts watching my house. Tyler organized a community meeting where people shared similar stories of HOA intimidation. An elderly couple had lost their deck. A single mom had been fined thousands for an unapproved fence that predated the HOA rules. "We need to rebuild differently," I told the group. "No more power trips. No more petty rules." The trial lasted 4 months. When the verdict finally came guilty on all counts, I felt oddly empty. Justice didn't immediately heal our divided community. The real turning point came during the spring thaw. I was struggling to clear storm debris from my yard when Diane's daughter pulled into my driveway. "Mom asked me to give you this," she said, handing me a sealed envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter from Diane, now awaiting sentencing under house arrest. I was wrong. My greed and pride destroyed lives, including my own. "The community garden you're planning, I'd like to donate my yard for it. It won't make up for what we did, but it's a start." 2 months later, I pushed a wheelbarrow across what had once been the boundary line between my property and Diane's. The soil was rich and dark, ready for planting. Neighbors worked together breaking ground for what would become the Pinecrest Community Garden. Tyler approached with a group of kids carrying seedlings. "The elementary school wants to help plant the vegetable section," he explained. "They're learning about where food comes from." I watched as former enemies worked side by side. Mrs. Abernathy, who once reported my wind chimes as a noise violation, now helped Mr. Garcia install irrigation lines. The family who had threatened to sue over my compost bin was now managing the community compost program. Dad arrived with pizzas for the volunteers. "In 30 years of law enforcement," he said, surveying the scene, "I've never seen justice quite like this." I nodded, understanding what he meant. True justice wasn't just about punishment, it was about rebuilding. As dusk approached, someone suggested we all gather for a photo. Standing together, surrounded by newly turned earth and freshly planted seedlings, I realized we'd created something revolutionary in its simplicity. A community where boundaries still existed but weren't barriers. "Next weekend," called a voice from the back, My place for a barbecue to celebrate our first planting. Cheers erupted as neighbors who once avoided eye contact now made plans to break bread together. Later, as twilight wrapped around us and fireflies began to dance above the new garden, Tyler and I sat on my porch steps. You know, he said quietly, Roger accidentally created exactly what he feared most. What's that? I asked. A neighborhood where property lines don't matter anymore. He smiled. We're all watching out for each other now. I realized he was right. In trying to divide us, our enemies had united us instead. The HOA signs at our neighborhood entrance had been replaced with a simple wooden marker, Pinecrest Heights, growing together.